Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled Optimize Your Value Story Through Integrated Evidence Generation from Bench to Patient. I'm Sydney Menson from the events team here at HealthEconomics.Com, and I'll be your host for today. This webinar has been sponsored by Syneos Health, so big thanks to them for helping to make this webinar possible. We're very fortunate to have 4 speakers joining us today. I'll first introduce Dr. Colin Oliver, a Managing Director in the Medical Affairs Consulting Practice at Syneos, with over 10 years of pharmaceutical and biotechnology experience. Next up, we have Dr. Anila Dede, an Executive Director in Real World and Late Phase at Syneos, who's an industry thought leader with 20 years of experience in business trends, RWE challenges, and opportunities. Our third speaker is Erwin de Kock, also an executive director in Real World and Late Phase at Syneos, who combines a scientific role with key business responsibilities, such as developing innovative solutions and growing real-world services. Finally, I'm happy to introduce Arshi Gupta, a managing director in medical affairs at Syneos, who leads global and regional efforts to transform clinical, medical affairs, and commercial activities. But just before we get started, here are a few housekeeping notes. First, if the panels on your screen are too big or too small, you can zoom in or out in your internet browser to adjust their size. Next up, the webinar is being recorded, and the video and its associated resources will be available to watch shortly afterwards. We'd love to hear from you and invite you to share any questions, thoughts, or comments in the Ask a Question panel that's shaking on your screen. We will be taking our questions in a Q&A session after the presentation. If you'd like to learn more about what's being presented today, explore the resources panel where we've added a few relevant links and downloads. And finally, if you happen to have a technical issue, refreshing the page nearly always fixes things. But if it doesn't, reach out to us using the Ask a Question box and we'll help you to troubleshoot. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Colin. Hi, Colin. Thanks for joining us today. The floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Sydney. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our discussion of integrated evidence strategy. Before we move into the discussion, I'd like to sort of overview what we're hoping to achieve today and what we're hoping you'll take away from this discussion. We do really want to hear from you, so please, I encourage you to ask questions within the chat. We want to make the Q&A session as dynamic as possible so that we can make sure that everybody truly understands where we're trying to go as an industry with regards to integrated evidence. So by the end of the webinar, we hope that you'll be able to, one, explain the importance of integrated evidence strategy. And we'll define what we mean by integrated evidence strategy in a little bit. We also want to help you cultivate integrated thinking and decision-making within your own organizations so that you can take the principles that we're going to overview today into your teams and your organizations to hopefully drive the industry forward to the future that we're sort of outlining here. And then finally, we really want to help you enable your teams to understand the key elements to a holistic integrated evidence strategy and how to optimize not only evidence generation, but also evidence dissemination. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So with that, I do want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing as an organization. As you know, as Syneos Health, we work across the industry, across a lot of different partners in evidence generation strategy, evidence dissemination strategy, real world evidence, and HEOR. And so we have the opportunity and the perspective to be able to see the different aspects that are happening in the industry, the different organizations across, small, medium, large pharma, biotech, med device, diagnostics, to see where people are currently at, where things are trying to go. And hopefully we can bring some of that experience and some of that perspective here to you so you can think a little bit more about your own organizations. So one of the things that we want to sort of point to as the needs of the landscape are changing is that there is an increasingly diverse and varied group of stakeholders that are consuming evidence that we're generating as pharmaceutical or biotech or as industry representatives, industry organizations. And so as we think about what it takes to develop an effective or an integrated evidence generation dissemination strategic plan, it starts with understanding who our stakeholders are, understanding what their needs are, and when they need that data in order to make clinical decisions or impact their understanding of unmet needs of the disease states in which we support, or our clinical programs, or the clinical value proposition of our assets. And so, we see and recognize that many organizations on some level start to think cross-functionally about this. But what we've identified and what I'm sure many of you have experienced, and we'll talk a lot more about this throughout the discussion today, is that there are a lot of organizations and entities that still operate in silos, that still focus solely on the stakeholders that are important to their function, and less on how the entirety of the company engages across the ecosystem. And so what we're trying to achieve through this process and through what we're going to walk through is to ensure that we have a clearly defined cross-functionally aligned strategy to generate and disseminate the right evidence to the right stakeholders at the right time to maximize the transition of all of our stakeholders through the awareness to advocacy continuum. So as I've kind of highlighted, the historical context of how we operated as an industry was focused really on a very narrow set of stakeholders, right? Evidence generation has historically, and in some companies to this day, remains focused on regulatory bodies and HCPs, treaters and approvers, right? But what we're seeing in the healthcare ecosystem at large is that the breadth of stakeholders is growing and expanding. And many organizations, many different functions are touching all of these different entities in different ways, engaging in different ways. And each of these entities have a different involvement in the consumption of evidence, in the consumption of data to support decision-making or to support recommendations or to support guidelines or to support advocacy. And whatever their role in the healthcare ecosystem might be, they have different evidentiary needs to support that role. And even further, to complicate the system that we're working within, each of those individual stakeholders resides within their own ecosystem, right? They have their own set of engagements or influences or decision-making bodies that they also have to interact with. And so the complexity of this ecosystem necessitates a different approach to evidence generation and dissemination to ensure that in order to impact each of our individual stakeholders, their ecosystem has the breadth of evidence and the depth of evidence that they need in order to support that engagement within their individualized ecosystem. And so our approach and what we're talking about today is integrated evidence strategy as the path forward to achieve the complexity and of dissemination and engagement of evidence generation that I've just outlined, right? And what we mean by that is not only integrated evidence generation, so that means bringing together all of the functions that generate evidence within an organization to define a comprehensive evidence generation plan early in the development life cycle, right? Because I think long gone or nearly gone are the days that generating evidence for regulatory approval only is sort of no longer considered the hallmark of success, right? A company can generate sufficient evidence for regulatory approval and still not be successful in commercialization because they haven't generated the necessary evidence for utilization, for access, for true understanding of the value proposition of the clinical program or of the asset. And so it's early integrated evidence generation planning, but it also couples dissemination. And what we've seen in the industry and historically is that evidence dissemination or publication planning, is I would say a narrow focus component of that, is done after the fact. It's done retroactively once evidence is coming, right? Once the evidence, once the evidence generation modality has been decided, it's been initiated, then dissemination starts publication planning starts to happen. And so what we're proposing as part of the way to sort of address this complex ecosystem that we all operate within is to couple and link not only cross-functional integrated evidence generation, but also dissemination planning. And that might be multi-channel dissemination, right? Not just publications, early and together so that we can meet the needs of our stakeholders at the right time. So with that, I'll pass it off to my colleague Anila to talk a little bit about the individual stakeholders that we work within and their needs.
I have tried to summarize here. It's not an all-inclusive list, but it's the majority and the well-established, more recognizable and more classical stakeholders. Effective stakeholder mapping needs to rely on the data collected from multiple sources and perspectives. And that's good that today I could see that there were multiple perspectives there, because I could see that you are interacting with different external stakeholders. The first one I have here in this slide are patients, and as we all know, what we're generating is all about improving treatment outcomes, patients' treatment outcomes, but also this is subject to reducing the cost or their clinical or medical pitfalls that are associated with a treatment. Physicians and healthcare providers is another very important stakeholders, which we work with regulators as well as payers, and then not to forget government. But what are some of the best practices to keep in mind when starting stakeholder mapping exercise? Actually, firstly, it's important to think strategically about the type of stakeholders to engage with. It doesn't mean because we have here the more well-established one or the more important ones that we have to engage with all of them. But we have to prepare for all of them in a very strategic way and early enough in the development of our strategy, because our strategy will be actually the one that will support the product through all the life cycle, but will not change, versus having agile tactics that will change. And these tactics will be really flexible around the stakeholders and their needs. So it's very important to think strategically about them and map them out. And also because it will alleviate any mismatches between identifying the ones that add value and the ones that actually are generally well established. Secondly, within this very fast changing environment, we should focus on increasing strategic depth and reach outside of the more traditional stakeholders. We don't mean that these traditional are not important, but it's important today because the digital tools and social media channels enable stakeholders such as patient advocacy groups to start up and make an impact very quickly with their space. So they're not following this very traditional pathway of a slow and long journey to becoming established. Therefore, continually finding and monitoring and embracing such organizations from a very early stage is important. Another very important stakeholder that I started with is patients. Patient centricity is growing and needs evidence to understand how the therapy might meet their needs. Patients today have access to a lot of information that was not the case before, but also they have also access to treatment decisions, and they would like to be part of their treatment decisions. Also, the fact that we have very innovative therapies and patients would like to be part of these innovations to improve their treatment patterns. It's also a pressure that leads to a huge impact on the evidentiary needs for this stakeholder. And therefore, we need to really have agile tactics, but also very well established strategy to address the knowledge that these patients are requiring, the stronger advocacy that they would like to have, and the personal impact of disease treatment that they would like to improve. And for this is already addressed at least, we know that at least 10 in the EU member states have a mechanism for patient engagement in their health technology assessment process, and mostly at the stage of advice, but also at the decision-making stage. So another very important, providers, clinicians, they need evidence to support optimal treatment decisions making. The more new therapies we launch, then the more clinicians need to understand how they differ from the existing ones and how best to use them. The predictors of response, as well as whether to switch patients or to keep them on the existing therapy, is really an important need that we need to address to have an impact on these stakeholders. And more real-world evidence is becoming a crucial aspect of supporting these evidentiary needs. Not to forget, of course, payers. They need evidence to support patient access, and they need to make increasingly complex decisions about coverage and reimbursement. Against a backdrop of rising healthcare and spending, aging populations, and rising number of innovative, but also not to forget high-cost treatment. So the strategic generation of evidence can help clarify the clinical, economic, and humanistic impact of a new therapy, which will have versus the standard of care that we're seeing or we are hoping to have versus the standard of care. So bearing in mind that different payers will have the different evidence needs at the right timing, we have to be prepared early enough and to have mapped rightly enough their needs. And then regulators. Regulators are the ones that we typically start with and beginning to consider evidence beyond randomized controlled trials. So they recognize now that the real-world evidence can help to accelerate drug development, and they are not limiting themselves only on the gold standard of randomized trials, but they are also considering real-world evidence. I can give you an example of the FDA approval for the indications expansion of a Pfizer compound Ibrance. The growing, which was done basically using the data from electronic health records and insurance claims. So typically, real-world evidence will be supporting by augmenting evidence, but the growing importance of this is also of the real-world evidence is also very visible. So I am switching to the next slide, where my colleague, Erwin de Kock, has done a great job of capturing and mapping up for each stakeholder the relative importance of evidentiary needs, and how it looks basically on an instance. It doesn't fit all the scenarios. There is no single recipe that can fit all the possible situations. But here is a great, if you want a picture of how it would look for a new compound, and it depends, of course, in many instances from the indication, from the life cycle momentum of the compound and the specific needs and of the disease ecosystem. So here you can see by stakeholder, but this also changes continuously and is evolving, as I mentioned. If we go to this slide, you can see that regulators, of course, expect the randomized trials and the gold standard of clinical development setting. However, more and more, as I mentioned, we are seeing in the real world evidence data to be implemented on this. And also it's important to highlight that we see a lot of variability on the stakeholders' request, and it's our duty to actually be consistent across stakeholders and across channels to provide a consistent strategy and a consistent messaging, and to have our external stakeholder face a consistent service and information. And lastly, I would like to finalize by saying these evidentiary needs vary also across different locations. And though there is a tendency to align in different regions like European Union, you can see that it's not the same. It's not the same in all the countries. So our stakeholder mapping will be very important, but also regionally focusing on the each country needs for each stakeholder is also very important. For example, Spain and Italy prioritize evidence on budget impact, while UK stresses cost effectiveness, while Germany emphasizes using the right standard of care as well as safety and efficacy. So providing the right evidence is very powerful. We have seen it, for example, in Japan, with the post-launch evidence, where the post-launch evidence showed that, for example, Berger and Eli Lilly's Jardiance product also were an indication for treating type 2 diabetes. They also proved to reduce risk of cardiovascular events. So focusing on the needs and using this understanding in all the settings early enough, but also in the later stage, and coordinating in a way that we can leverage them is very important. And closing, I would like to highlight that stakeholders play a key role and on the patient and the product journey, and identifying, profiling, and engaging with the right stakeholder is of critical importance to ensure success. Now I would like to pass it over to my colleague Erwin about talking and taking us through internal stakeholders.
Okay, so I will focus on the actually internal stakeholders, the current operating model within biopharmaceutical companies. Okay, so this is about functions within organizations. This will surely resonate with you all if you work in biopharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of functions that are all part of that current operating model to generate and disseminate evidence. And a lot of these functions, they could pivot around medical affairs, but obviously also around clinical development or commercial. And I'm sure some or lots in the audience will be working in health economics outcomes research or market access and epidemiology, and might actually wonder sort of how do they all fit in within this larger framework, and how can they all ensure that there's efficient collaboration between the various groups. Okay, so on this slide, I would like to actually home in on this a little bit, sort of on the different roles, to actually see what the internal stakeholders' responsibilities are, and also see that they're actually not perfectly aligned, or we say imperfectly aligned. And that's because they all have different functions and different focus, some of which overlaps between other functions, but in many cases it doesn't overlap. Without going through all of these, I think it's pretty clear medical affairs is the function within the organization that focuses on interaction with healthcare professionals, and therefore they will heavily focus on the HCP's needs, whereas the regulatory function heavily focuses on the regulator needs. And if you go all the way down to market access, for example, we can actually bring up another mission statement, which is getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time, and if possible, at the right price. So they will focus on other aspects, including things like cost effectiveness, with a heavy focus on one of their stakeholders, which is payers and HTA agencies. So the question when you see this and all these different functions is who could take the lead in what is a very complex process? Could it be medical affairs? Maybe not only, but medical affairs will surely have to collaborate very closely with clinical, marketing, and all the other functions. So that's really the challenge we have here. So the current model towards evidence generation, in our experience working with biopharmaceutical organizations, we see some recurrent themes. There's obviously established hierarchies, and that's necessary. And we also see that in most organizations, they function with cross-functional teams on different assets, with many times lifecycle management functions that overlay those different departmental structures and provide support. But there still remains a risk for siloed thinking, as Colin alluded to earlier. Previously, I mentioned that statement, the mission statement, what evidence is needed for what stakeholder at what time, which I think is essential. And the reality is that how to do this is a really complex process. I think everybody agrees. It requires a lot of inputs from across different departmental functions, includes things like the integrated development plan, the target product profile, looking at competitor analyses, different products, when those products could come onto the market, overview of all planned and existing evidence. But maybe one area that we see might be lacking is to have that external stakeholder input built in early on as the plans are actually being built. We oftentimes still see that real-world evidence generation is more linear in nature, so that the manufacturer designs the research without much of that stakeholder input. And that's certainly something that we advocate, should change, right? That you should be considering all your external stakeholders actively in that process. Not all evidence needs are equally relevant or important, and there needs to be an element of identifying what the gaps are and how to prioritize those gaps. So on the next slide, Anita already showed a similar slide. And I need to make a statement first that the color coding is just illustrative, right? But it is to show the relative importance of evidence needs by different stakeholders. It's to show the different dimensions that we're actually dealing with and that make this process so complex. So on the left-hand side, these would be functions within the biopharmaceutical organization that may or may not have a parallel with the stakeholder functions that they could represent. And on the top side, the x-axis, it's a couple of dimensions of evidence. So the colors are the relative importance. And I think what that does is actually visualizes which items are really important, sort of must have, and what other items could be nice to have. And you see, obviously, you can highlight efficacy is important for everybody, but that's not the case for things like adherence, which could be seen by many functions as sort of a nice to have or low level of importance. And this is something that actually we use a lot when we develop our evidence generation plans to help sit with customers, understand by different functions what their needs are, and through visualizing it actually help them to prioritize and then also take the right decisions in terms of their strategies. The next slide is actually the next step in that process. So once you've identified the various evidence gaps, you've identified and you prioritize them between various functions, then you need to determine the tactics to execute on a wider strategy and to fill those gaps. And that's where real-world research is unique. So we don't have one single golden standard design like a randomized clinical trial. You have a myriad of different methodological approaches to collect clinical, economic, and humanistic evidence. So there's not a one size fits all. Every type of design will be suitable for different types of endpoints. And by visualizing it, it also helps, in our experience, the customers a lot to determine what is sort of the best combination of different types of designs to help them achieve sort of to fill those evidence gaps. And within Syneos, we have actually developed an algorithm that helps decision makers for their real-world research designs based on a series of structured yes and no questions. So there's no time during this webinar. It's probably the topic for another webinar, but there is some material actually available for the audience on the Syneos Health website. And then my last slide to sort of wrap this all up. What are challenges we see with the current model towards evidence generation? So I hope I did emphasize that interpretation of evidence gaps is really important and probably differs by different functions, and also how these gaps are being prioritized. So often without due diligence on actually the external stakeholder needs or even the internal stakeholder functions. So it is important that there's a lot of communication internally, but also externally with the stakeholders that are represented. The process itself for determining the suitability of the designs is highly technical. And we see oftentimes sponsors struggle with the complexity of different real-world research designs and selecting the most appropriate and cost-effective models. So it needs people that have a health economics, market access background, pharmacoepidemiological skills, and so forth. An isolated or siloed approach to evidence generation could actually lead to critical evidence that's being omitted, or even the wrong evidence being generated at the wrong time for the wrong stakeholder. So that's definitely not the position you want to be in when you're close to launching your product. And then lastly, different evidence generation tactics that are being developed at different stages by different functions, they may therefore become incompatible, ineffective, and inefficient. And that's where it is so critical to have an integrated evidence strategy. And I'll hand it over to my colleague Arshi. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Arshi Gupta. Before we go into really talking about what my colleagues just talked today around, we talked about the current trends, we talked about stakeholders, we talked about what's happening in the industry. We just want to share some perspectives on what happens when EG and ED, so evidence generation and evidence dissemination, are decoupled. And there's a lot of, isolated approaches. There is very siloed approaches. There's inadequate cross-functional input. And also, you can't really keep this more sustainable because you're doing it in a very siloed manner. And I'll talk to you about some of the misses and lessons learned that we've seen in the industry, and talk about where we have seen best practices in bringing EG, so evidence generation and evidence dissemination, together to form your integrated evidence strategy. So, based on what you heard from my colleagues earlier in the discussion, really the environment that we are in today really warrants a concerted effort to ensure that the scientific evidence needed to support the value proposition of an asset is coordinated across functions, is coordinated across the geographies, because there is only that much pool of resources. When I talk about resources, it's people and money, where you've prioritized what is it that the ecosystem at large is requiring, and is there some evidence that can be generated which could address multiple stakeholders' need. So as any problem statement that we're trying to solve, we've brought in here as well, the 5 Ws and the H framework to ensure that the building blocks are in place with really an aim to synergize evidence generation and dissemination activities across functions, across geographies, to really have that maximal impact. And those who are reading on the slide might think this is only the 5. Where is the fourth W here, which is where, which really brings me to the next point around dissemination. And in dissemination, we have seen a lot of organizations decouple evidence generation from evidence dissemination. And they're really not mutually exclusive. They are really forming that continuous loop, because the right timing of disseminating data to the right stakeholders is as important, and in fact more important, to make sure that there are no missteps in generating that scientific value proposition. Some of the key considerations to keep in mind are: have you identified your right stakeholder segments? Have you identified what are the key gaps in their knowledge and awareness levels? Do you know what the current patient journey is? Do you know where there are gaps in the patient journey that can be addressed through evidence generation and then hence through dissemination? And these activities can really span across multiple generation methodologies and modalities, right? It could be RWE, it could be PROs, it could be HEOR, it could be comparative effective analysis. So there's a lot of evidence generation that can happen, and then you need to do the mapping to the right stakeholders. And you need to also think about, I think in the polling question, some people touched upon having access to data. So do you have all the access to potential data sources to ensure that your evidence generation priorities are aligned and really support the asset's ambition? And also, it's not just internal perspective, but is it really addressing your external stakeholders' needs as well? So if we look at this slide, in order to bring this, concept of IES, which is Integrated Evidence Strategy, which comprises of generation and dissemination, to life, we need to take a stepwise approach to ensure it's proactive approach in generating accurate, balanced as well. So you're not only looking at populations at large, but can you really do some subpopulation analysis as well? And are you bringing compelling evidence to support the improvement in patients' outcome and care? We need to align the priorities for evidence generation and evidence dissemination to ensure that we are leveraging cross-functional expertise at both global, regional, and local levels through clear communication. We need to map out what's the aspirational state. So what kind of tools, data, and resources are required to move you from current assessment to future assessment in generating that evidence? And you need to make sure that evidence generation is purposeful and really aligns to the priority data needs and is timely, because if it's not generated at the right time, at the right place for the right stakeholders, then you're taking few steps back in your commercialization stages. Last, here I'll show you what does good look like. And this is that continuous loop that we talked about, right? That if you really make evidence generation and evidence dissemination and bring all the puzzle pieces, so your enablers that help with the generation and then enablers that help with the dissemination, this is what good looks like in a framework where you're utilizing a multi-channel approach. So you're not really looking at just one channel of generating or disseminating evidence, but it's that multi-channel or omni-channel approach of both generating and disseminating. And also, have you put in place the mechanism to really measure the impact? So is generating evidence with one activity versus the other, which one is really creating the maximum impact, and for which stakeholders, so that you can really look at these learnings and put in a model that is more scalable and productive for the organization. So to sum it up, I will go through our best practices, and the best practices here are around, IES should be proactive. It should be aligned to a consistently objective approach. It needs to make sure that your external stakeholders their needs are being addressed, and the cultural changes required in your organization are really genuine, and you've put together a cross-functional approach to ensure that you can really unlock the asset's potential and drive evidence generation early on in the life cycle. So what does that mean? That you move from being siloed and isolated to more aligned. You be more proactive. So it's not reactive evidence generation and evidence dissemination, but a proactive approach. And you want to make sure that your plans are not just looking at your current local level, but you're looking at all your cross-functional and global teams together to ensure there is one integrated evidence strategy versus one for the US, one for Germany, but how can you pull it together based on stakeholder needs in various regions? Now I'm going to make sure that we had promised we'll have Q&A. So go into the Q&A session. Sydney, if we can.
Thank you, everyone, for your great presentations. Let's jump right into it. The first question that we have is talking about underserved populations. So will there be any recommendations of filling the access disparity gap?
So I'll jump in and then open it up to the rest of the team. So I think what we're seeing is particularly in the United States, right? The FDA has issued guidance earlier this year about a mandatory process for organizations during their development phase to identify their plan for generating data in representative patient populations. And I think what you'll see as we progress into the future is this will become more and more mandatory, more and more critical. And many organizations, for those of you who attended ASCO, for example, it was a hot topic of discussion across almost every company in their booth, in sessions. We're talking about how to solve this challenge, because it is a challenge particularly in the United States, to encourage underserved patient populations to join clinical trials. And so this is where there may be opportunity for alternative or supplemental evidence generation approaches, like like some of the real world techniques that Erwin described, to generate that evidence in those underserved patient populations. But I think it's a very sort of timely question, because I think we'll see increasingly over the next couple of years that this will be critical to commercial success and potentially even regulatory approval. So I don't know, team, if you have other additional thoughts on this question.
Okay, I think
you covered it, Colin.
Yeah. Let's just move to the next question then. Okay. What would you propose to a cross-functional asset team to help them to prioritize their evidence needs and build a roadmap towards evidence generation? I think this one would be for you, Erwin, if you want to take a shot first.
Absolutely. You can all hear me okay? Yep. Okay, good.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a lot of communication, right? I think that it came across in my presentation, but also Arshi's. Cross-functional discussions. I think in the polling questions, we've actually seen that there was some agreements and disagreements about collaboration. So that's probably the first step, that the different functions understand each other's job, really, function and perspectives and needs. And then also within the function, that you understand what are the stakeholders' needs of the function you serve, right? For example, medical affairs serves the HCP function, that you actually go out to these HCPs and talk to them. So something that we do a lot when we engage with our customers with this exercise is actually that it's setting up workshops, or it's setting up external panels of people to understand, okay, what's interesting for them, right? For given, like thinking about the new assets in a given indication. Okay, so that's definitely the first aspect. And then I mentioned a lot about the prioritization. I mean, the beauty of real-world research is it's multidimensional, right? All these stakeholders with their evidence needs, but that makes it very complex, right? That you really sit together and go through all these different types of evidence and data. You look what's already there, look where the gaps are, and then collaborate with the colleagues to identify and prioritize, and then look at the right real-world research designs. And again, that's something, I mean, as an organization within Syneos, we are a commercial and a clinical organization, meaning we run studies, we design studies, and that's something that we definitely support our customers, right, to understand what design would be most suitable, but also from like a feasibility perspective and timelines. Not sure if my colleagues want to add any perspectives.
Great response, Erwin. Doesn't look like anyone else wants to add. Archie, maybe you have something you want to add to that? No? Okay. Let's move on to our next question. How do you identify knowledge, attitude, and practice of stakeholders towards evidence generation? Anyone can take this one.
I can take this one. You saw me jump out of my seat, but absolutely. And the way, just want to repeat, it's knowledge, access, and what was the last thing, Sydney? I want to make sure I touch on everything.
Knowledge, attitude, and practice.
Yeah, knowledge, attitude, and practice. Okay. So we've done this a lot, and the way you really need to address their knowledge is what we call it a knowledge evolution index. And what we are trying to do is using a multimodality form. So we're not going back to, age-old things of surveying stakeholders. We are really understanding what is their knowledge-seeking preference. Where do they go when they want to learn about new assets? Where do they go when they want to learn about mechanism of action? Within Syneos, we've developed a large data set around this for certain therapeutic areas where we have understanding of specialties, we have understanding of subspecialties of stakeholders on what their knowledge evolution looks like when they're learning and when they're also thinking about what kind of evidence needs they might have for their patient population. So you look at baseline assessment of that stakeholder, and then you continue to do longitudinal assessments to see where have they moved from their baseline to longitudinal assessments in their knowledge-seeking preference. The same goes for attitudes, because as we talk about it, right, when you look at people's capabilities and competencies, it's around skills, attitudes, and behaviors. So we do a very similar data-driven methodology to first look at your entire medical universe, which is your ecosystem at large, and then look at segments from there and see, are there any similar attitudes for cohorts in there? And this is not done primarily through prescription of what kind of drugs they're prescribing or where are they speaking. Again, we use a multimodal methodology here around their clinical and scientific variables to understand what kind of practices they are following, how much of the guidelines are they using when they're treating their patients, and what attitudes do they have in really pushing the envelope, just not for the asset in mind, but overall for the disease state as well. I'll pause if my colleagues have anything to add here.
I think that's great. I think you touched on everything. around that question. Has there been any successful example of integrated evidence strategy? This one might also be one for you, Arshi, if you want to touch on that one.
Yep, if I may actually, instead of going on the positive side, I'll share something on the flip side, and then that can explain how if things were done in the right manner, it would have been a successful example. So we were working with a client in the bone disorder space, and what we noticed was that there was very little cross-functional talk. There was very little being shared on what people were learning from doing different kinds of activities. So when I say different kind of activities was, the medical teams were running ad boards. The clinical team had, of course, done the analysis and run the trials and had insights. So every function was having their own insights, but there was no concerted effort to bring the teams together to really talk about, are we hearing about the same things? Are we really understanding, is regulatory, as Colin was saying, the hallmark of success? So clinical was, R&D was running towards, regulatory approval without really keeping in mind what the market access team had understood from the payers, from the health systems in the US, on how they will really take this asset into consideration when it comes to reimbursement and providing broader access. They weren't talking, and it was a bit too late where when we shared the output with the team saying this is something that your payers and your access bodies are requiring in terms of evidence, but you are really rushing to get this regulatory approval and launch the product, but it might miss the step and it might miss that access importance, and you'll face challenges post-launch. So based on these recommendations, the client really took a step back, and this resulted in almost a year-long delay for them, where they didn't launch as per timelines and ensured that they were collecting the right evidence to make sure they didn't have any hurdles post-launch. Hopefully that provides perspective, but if anyone else from the Syneos team wants to add on success stories or lessons learned, I'd welcome their thoughts.
Yeah, I'll add a success story that I think we see in some companies where it maybe is not the fully integrated evidence strategies that we've talked about, because I think this is a newer concept that we're seeing, and a few organizations that we're working with are actually pushing to develop these more formal processes around this integrated evidence strategy now. So we don't have an output or a success story because they're just now building this capability. But I think we've seen organizations, and many of you probably have experienced this, where their evidence generation and evidence dissemination strategies are tightly linked and working together in early lockstep, to the point where they're able to generate the evidence and disseminate the evidence and plan for that in a timely enough manner where they can, for example, release a New England Journal article at the same time that the podium presentation is happening at a conference, right? I think these are smaller examples of where a very tight coordination integration across the functions can really have a profound impact on the organization, on the data that's being generated.